author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Donald Trump beset at all sides by the threat of indictment as he forces his way to the top of the Republican primary rankings. Now, will Alvin Bragg be the one to topple his rise, or will that come from an area far closer to home? Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio American Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's special edition, we tackle the possible indictment of the former president, how this looks politically, and the legal ramifications that involves. Also, we'll be delving into Governor Ron DeSantis and his potential 2024 run. I want to take a moment to say a special thank you to our listeners in Cadillac, Missouri on WATT, 1240 AM and 106.1 FM. Thanks for being here. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. The walls are closing in on former President Donald Trump, as they apparently have been for the last 5 years. Now, is the latest full court press by Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg to catch the Donald out for an alleged hush money payment to Stormy Daniels the real deal? Or is it just another headline machine with more smoke than fire? Now, we're very fortunate to have our special Liberty Nation analysis triumvirate of longtime host of this here show and senior political analyst, Mr. Tim Donner, legal affairs editor and host of the excellent Uprising podcast, Mr. Scott DeSantis, Esquire, and, as I'm the guy with the record button today, me. Thanks for being here, gents.
Oh, thanks.
You're welcome.
Mark, always good.
Okay, so let's start with the legal aspect here. Scott, let's get the basics down. What, if charges do appear, is the crime likely to be?
There's no legal aspect to consider. It should just go to Tim for the political question. This is just a political story, not a legal story. That's my analysis of it. But go ahead and ask your question again, please. I'll give you a serious response.
If Trump does in fact get charged, now we're recording on Thursday morning, so as of now, Trump hasn't been charged. If he is charged, what is the charge likely to be?
Okay, the charge is likely to be that he submitted a falsified or created, had or caused to come into creation a false business record in violation of New York state law. And then there's some other way that then that gets tripped up into a felony, because that in and of itself, as I understand it, is a misdemeanor. I'm not a New York lawyer, and I'm not terribly familiar with all their little jots and tittles. But oftentimes, some law might reference another law that allows it, where the breaking of one law can, in certain circumstances, be kind of ballooned into a greater criminal culpability. And that's, as I understand the speculation, how Mr. Bragg, to the extent that he thinks he might be able to get Donald Trump criminally indicted, that's the mechanism.
I can see the headlines: Trump done for jaywalking. Now, Tim, you and I have.
Listen, if they could get it, if they could get him for that, they would. I mean, the idea that there's something that they.
It could be for going 56 in a 55-mile-an-hour zone.
That too, 55 and a half. Get him.
There you go. Now, I won't name names, but last time I was driving in the United States, I was informed by someone that 55 is the minimum you should be going. I won't say who that was. Now, Tim, you and I have memories that stretch back for more than a week and a half. But wasn't Hillary Clinton just fined for something very similar when her campaign paid for the now wildly debunked Steele dossier?
Well, you know what? If I was a leftist and I'm looking at all the possible methods of snagging Donald Trump one way or another, this would probably be at the very bottom of the list. I mean, it's so flimsy. It's not even the hush money payment. It's how it was presented to the government. It's something it's a law that's never been used in New York as a felony charge. As a misdemeanor, perhaps, but now it's looking like Bragg's case might be falling apart. And he's under a lot of pressure from the left. Part of it is just get him. Doesn't matter how you get him, just get him. Get him in a perp walk if you can. And that'll be enough for our base. But the other half is saying, please don't do this because this is so flimsy and you may not even be able to make it stick. which means it'll be so much harder to try and prosecute January 6th related things or the Mar-a-Lago raid or anything else. So they're in a real quandary here. There's a long, as I like to say, a long, proud tradition of hush money in national politics.
Yes.
And I mean, we can go back to 2004 when John Edwards was running as vice president on the John Kerry ticket. He was unmasked for paying hush money to a woman who he had impregnated while his wife was battling cancer. I mean, it's the worst of all possible circumstances. Now, of course, they'll say, well, but it's not the hush money. It's that it was used, in a sense, as an illegal campaign contribution. That's a distinction without a difference in most people's minds. They're going to see he's snagged for hush money, and it's going to set loose a bombardment of stories about past hush money episodes like Hillary Clinton, like John Edwards. So, I mean, I think this has been misplayed and botched badly. And I think it's going to cost the left big time, whether he actually is indicted or not at this point, because it's become such a spectacle.
This is the Al Capone job, isn't it? It's where they couldn't get him for anything, so they went after him for taxes.
But even worse,
because
people had been snagged for tax evasion before.
Yeah.
Nobody's been snagged under this particular statute. So what do you think if you're an average voter and you hear that a statute is being used against Donald Trump for the first time ever? You're going to conclude, boy, they really are out to get him, aren't they? And I'm not just talking about Trump supporters. I'm talking about the average voter who's looking at this and going, really? This is what they're going to try and get him on?
It is entirely about optics. Yeah, it really does seem that how things are presented. Now, Scott, you know the motto of North Carolina, I believe. If you could just, I can't remember the Latin for that. Can you remember that?
Not the Latin, but it's to be rather than to seem, I think, is the phrase you're looking for, right?
Yeah, and at the moment it's seeing rather than being. Now we've talked about Alvin Bragg, but his career here, it really is, I believe, on a razor's edge, isn't it? Because at the time,
well, he's got the people of New York City to vote for him. I mean, what are you talking about? It's not like there's he's not in like a purpley jurisdiction where like he's going to have to say.
Sure. Point taken, but Scott, he is. I think the numbers speak for themselves in terms of he has failed to prosecute an increasingly wide range of more violent crimes, but he has the Donald Trump attack in his back pocket.
This is the campaign the guy ran.
Can they forgive him if Donald Trump gets away with it, and they've had all the massive crime spike with no prosecutions? Can they forgive him for that?
No.
So a simple answer from Tim there.
In
what
a
are you
word,
thinking, Scott?
Well, I'm not the political analyst that Tim is, and I'm also not the former New Yorker that Tim is, so I'll take his answer on it. But I just see this as like, if you're going to put that guy in office, the failure to come up with an indictable offense against Donald Trump, I don't know, does that really matter to the average New Yorker?
Well, I will say this.
Let me just add this one thing, which is the power of incumbency in that office is almost beyond measure. So that argues to me for his reelection, no matter what the situation with Trump is.
Final word to Tim, then.
Well, Scott said it in passing, but it's a critical thing here. This is Alvin Bragg, when he was running for district attorney, actually wore on his sleeve the fact that he was going to get Trump. He was going to get Trump one way or another. So, in effect, he's fulfilling a campaign promise unlike any I've ever seen before. And now, if he can't close the deal, I think New Yorkers will generally be very upset, because not just because he didn't get Trump, but because it looked like he would and could, but didn't.
I think, by the way, it was Letitia James who said the exact words "get Trump," and maybe Mr. Bragg said words that were similar to that.
That
but not
same
maybe
effect,
that specific,
yes.
two
Yes.
words.
Must be something about New York and in the water. Now, we're talking with the LN Triumvirate on the potential Trump indictment. We'll be back after this short break with Tim and Scott to discuss how the investigations impact Trump 2024. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with Scott Cosenza and Tim Donner. Earlier in the show, we tackled the meat and bones of the potential indictment, but now I want to delve into the political ramifications. So let's talk about how the indictment, or shall I say, the indictments that Donald Trump is facing, how they're going to impact his chance of winning the Republican nomination, for which he is at present the absolute forerunner. Tim, does it help or hinder his campaign?
I think there's no question that it helps his campaign, which seems counterintuitive because when a guy's about to be arrested, you wouldn't think that that would assist his campaign. But there's a major caveat in that. And I think we saw it in the remarks of some of the participants in the January 6th riot at the Capitol, where they said, you know, we're never going to do this for this guy again. Basically, that, you know, we went all out for Trump and all we got was this lousy lost election, right? I'm not sure that his base is quite as fired up this time as they have been, certainly in 16 and in 20. But at the same time, he is a beneficiary of really good fortune here because the fact that this charge is so flimsy gives him all kinds of latitude to go after Alvin Bragg and the left as, you know, targeting him specifically with an obscure statute that had never been tried really before, but was being used basically as a single-minded use against Donald Trump. Probably never be used again. Hasn't been used before. But Donald Trump thinks it's going to benefit him because he has said in remarks that haven't, been denied that he wants the full perp walk. He wants handcuffs. He wants the whole thing because he thinks that helps him. Whereas the left thinks that same scenario helps them. And seeing that we've never had a former president arrested and indicted for anything before, we're in uncharted territory. But I think it doesn't hurt Trump at all in this instance when you add to it the fact that the Mar-a-Lago case has got to be coming apart at the seams for the fact that Joe Biden was possessing so many classified documents of his own. So here's two.
Hey, Tim, sorry, I have to interrupt. That is complete whataboutism. I mean, Joe Biden's was stored next to a Corvette. I mean, at least one batch was stored next to a Corvette. Surely that was safe, right?
Well, admittedly, that was as safe as you could possibly get next to a Corvette
Not like it's next to an Audi
garage in Delaware. Okay, I'll stipulate that, Mark. I will. But there is a lot of whataboutism here because they can't go after Trump on Mar-a-Lago the way they did before after what happened with the Biden classified documents. And they can hardly go hard after him here to say he's committed some heinous crime that the average person can't relate to at all. What? He put it on the wrong line in his tax return? Is that you're going to perp walk him for that?
Yeah.
I don't think so. So net out, it's never good to be a presidential candidate who's under indictment, but at the same time, Trump's not like anyone else. And I think the left is caught in a quandary between they want to run against Trump because they think they can beat him, but they're scared to death of what happens if they lose to him.
Absolutely. Now, Scott, I do want to delve into the legal aspects of this. Now, bear with me.
I'd just like to say that for the last 40 years, Donald Trump has operated under one premise. He wants people to talk about Donald Trump, good, bad, or indifferent.
Oh, yeah.
And he sees that as a positive. And what are we doing right now? And what is everybody else doing this week? Talking about Donald Trump. So
no such thing as bad publicity.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. Now, Scott, am I right in thinking that and I might be wrong here, but that even under indictment, Donald Trump can still campaign. I've even heard that Donald Trump could technically be in prison and still become the 47th president.
Yeah, there's no barrier to camp. I mean, famously, maybe you don't know the name of this name, but Lyndon LaRouche is the name of a famous Democrat candidate for president. He had his own sort of cult-like following, and in many places in the country, so you have to remember that who gets on the ballot for a presidential election is determined in each state. Yeah. So it wouldn't be necessarily nationwide that he was on the ballot, but he was on the ballot in many states. Certainly, I saw his name on many presidential ballots, and he was in prison. So there's no barrier there. And being under indictment just means that, I mean, you can see how ridiculous it can be to mean that you're under indictment, meaning on flimsy facts, on crimes that are hardly crimes, and so that's even a much lower bar. The idea that being under indictment would somehow prohibit one from running for office is just that's not part of our
I have a follow-up on that, Scott. You've mentioned this to me before, but I think it's worth pointing out to our listeners that a grand jury that's been impaneled, they only get to see what the prosecutor wants them to see, which brings about, I believe the term is, a grand jury would indict a ham sandwich. Is that correct?
Actually, the quote about the ham sandwich is by Saul Wachtler, I think is how you say his last name, who was a chief judge, I think, of New York at one point. And he said it when he was criticizing the grand jury process. He wanted to change it. He said, it's worthless. You can indict a ham sandwich. Why are we even going through this burlesque that somehow it's some barrier? Because the idea, Mark, of course, the grand jury is the citizen's protection against a prosecutor who would bring charges absent showing of evidence and probable cause. And so how it works is the idea is that the prosecutor says, hey, I have this evidence against this person. We need the people to agree before we put them through the burden of criminal charges and a trial. So it's the check for the defendant, right, by the people. So, but what they don't have is, if you are, for instance, Donald Trump, you don't get to, and you're ordered to appear before the grand jury, you don't get to have your counsel presented. You don't get to have evidence presented. And there's been a lot of really misreporting, scandalously bad factual statements about what it means. Like I think I saw Marjorie Taylor Greene say that, or he should be prosecuted. Mr. Bragg should be prosecuted for not including exculpatory evidence before the grand jury. Right. You have no right to the presentation of exculpatory evidence. That's what a criminal trial is for. For the grand jury, it's just one person telling a story. It's the prosecutor telling a story. And that's why that ham sandwich line was accurate. It's because if I tell you a story, I could indict anybody on anything without a single word of evidence to the contrary. So.
Okay, well, and especially New York, I mean, I think any other state in the union, they'd have a harder time handing back an indictment against Donald Trump outside of New York. Now, don't go anywhere. Later in the show, we're going to dive deep into Ron DeSantis and his 2024 prospects. But after this short break, we're back with Scott and Tim to discuss political lawfare. Don't touch that dial. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
We've seen the law of the land employed against politicians and political causes. But is this a modern aberration, especially in light of the attempted indictment of former President Donald Trump by Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg? Now, we're back with Tim Donner and Scott DeSantis to shed a little light on the otherwise dark underbelly of American jurisprudence. Now, it seems to me, Scott, that even the appearance of weaponizing American justice comes with some notable downsides. What does this do to people's faith in the justice system?
Well, we're only going to really discover this in hindsight, but it is so, I mean, just to the pit of my stomach, it makes me just feel so awful about the disgrace that Mr. Bragg has exhibited here, and contempt for, the processes that I hold dear. That, the administration of justice is not supposed to be imposed for political use, but it seems to me that there's no other rational explanation for this. If we take any human being, any American, and we just say, let's examine, and we'll give to every prosecutor wherever they ever lived or did business, and just give them almost unlimited resources. Just go through and just decide. Maybe they broke some law somewhere. One of the things that's not talked about too is some of these progressive anti-Trump forces have supplied with their own money personnel for these DA offices to go after these people. So it's like, it's the total politicization of the criminal justice system, which
it's the GoFundMe justice system.
I mean, it's disheartening. It's really horrible. But the people get, the justice that they vote for and they deserve by their participation in the political process. New Yorkers put Alvin Bragg in. It seems crazy to me, but I don't think they need a recount in that election. He clearly won it, and they're getting what they voted for.
I mean, here's the thing: people in New York voted Bill de Blasio in as mayor. They complained about him constantly. Then they reelected him, and they complained some more. And I basically said, "You don't have any right to complain. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me." So de Blasio got reelected, and it was a disaster. If there's one good thing about this, Mark, I think it's that it will shed light on what George Soros is doing to upend the entire prosecutorial system in the United States by funding to the tunes of tens of millions of dollars. He has brilliantly managed to steer district attorney races across the country in different localities.
Tim, I have to interrupt and say you're wrong by using the word steer. He has installed district attorneys across the country with his...
Well, I'll say steer only because they do actually have to be voted in. But, you're seeing the specter of races where ordinarily, say, $10,000 is spent on a campaign, and these guys, Soros-backed DA candidates, will spend $2-3 million. And they'll do it in Democratic cities. So if this can shed some light on what George Soros has done, for example, in Philadelphia with Larry Krasner, who Scott knows well, the district attorney there, we saw that the district attorney in San Francisco was recalled, as a matter of fact.
Boudin, wasn't it?
Chesa Boudin was, but
all of Northern Virginia and Washington, D.C., have Soros DAs.
And people don't even know that. And I think it's up to the responsible media at this point to do expansive examinations of the Soros role in taking crimes that used to be crimes and aren't crimes anymore, because the Trump thing is one thing, but it's how Alvin Bragg diminished so many felonies down to the point of misdemeanors so that violent criminals are being released. And he's going after Trump for the wrong line on a form to report to the government.
Well,
I think everybody can see it.
It isn't a wrong line. It's that he intentionally entered this as something that it wasn't. Right. And that's the crime. And Mark, right. I have long championed, I don't know that I've ever convinced a single person that this is the way to go, but I have long championed a constitutional amendment that would prohibit any prosecutor from seeking or winning any other elected office, because they use their prosecutorial offices and stand on the backs of criminal defendants to gain further office. And before it was Trump, I noticed it as I was, becoming a lawyer, is just the drug war stuff. You see it a lot of times on these human trafficking cases where they bust a lot of prostitution and then yell about human trafficking, but they don't actually make a human trafficking charge. But they're using the power of their office to then become the governor or a member of Congress or something like that.
Or vice president of the United States. Yeah, I think we're making a direct comparison there.
I think that becomes particularly troublesome when you consider that.
By the way, Scott, you have a convert. I agree completely. Completely.
I'll mark you down.
Yes, I've supported that ever since Scott first brought it up. And the trouble is when you're talking about positions where by necessity you have to engage in selective prosecution. You think it from the Justice Department all the way down to local DAs. They can't prosecute every single crime. So they have to select. And it's what crimes they select that tells the story of their stewardship. And with Alvin Bragg. I'll tell you, the people of New York are walking in a type of fear that I haven't seen since maybe the 1970s because of the criminals that are being set loose by Alvin Bragg's ideas on what criminal justice should be. He is a poster child for George Soros and his theory of criminal justice.
Well, let's jump in on that, Tim. So, obviously, we've seen George Soros-backed district attorneys put into office around the country, or elected into office around the country, thanks in large part, we would assume, to the money that he's provided. Because if the money didn't help, then he wouldn't be giving it, right? But
correct.
In terms of value for money, isn't a district attorney's race, isn't it basically the best return on investment that you can get for your money in terms of reshaping America to your will?
I got to jump in and just say George Soros got the best ROI that you could imagine on this.
Yes.
I mean, he spent pennies on the dollar for what he got. It was an amazing that he saw the opportunity and he seized it without really much in the way of resistance, at least early on. It's a remarkable story.
Yeah, it's a great, and the success of it is what really makes it so dangerous, because then this is a model that's going to be followed across the country, because it worked, didn't it?
It did. I mean, for $10 to $20 million, he's locked up some of the biggest and most populous cities in the country. Now, I have a bit of an existential question, if you gentlemen don't mind. Can politics in present day America exist without an army of lawyers? Scott?
I hope not. Actually, that's the opposite of the truth. I would hope so, but I don't. But no, because that's where there are gains to be made, and people who are, when you see how party politics works in this country, you can think of the forces that are amassed on one side, and if they think they can gain advantage by using lawyers, there's so much on the line. One of the things that those of us that are small government advocates talk about is that the more that the government has their hands in, that just becomes the more reason to try to control the keys to the government, right? If everything we do, from the car we drive and what powers it and our internet and every little jot and tittle of life, the more the government's involved in it, well, that just becomes more reason to get a say in, what's allowed and what's not. So I think it's just going to accelerate rather than decelerate.
So it's pretty much the expansion of government is essentially a full employment act for lawyers around the world. Now,
yes.
coming up in just a moment, we'll be picking apart the polls on Trump and DeSantis in 2024, the Republican primaries. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
2024 is closer than you think, and so far, the only major contender to officially announce is former President Donald Trump. Current President Joe Biden is still reluctant to proclaim his intent, and the dark horse of the race, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, recently gave an interview that was full of, as Paul Simon might say, hints and allegations. Now, we're back with the top team triumvirate, and I want to know how they measure the rising tide in American politics. Now, Tim, I think we're all agreed that Governor Ron DeSantis is throwing his hat in the ring for the GOP nomination. How do you rate him as a candidate, specifically his chances against Donald Trump?
Well, to the matter of whether he's actually running or not, the fact that he said in his interview with Piers Morgan that, I'm going to read it exactly, I have what it takes to be president and I can beat Biden. Okay, so that takes care of any doubts about whether he's going to run or not.
He's an undeclared candidate at this point.
Now, Donald Trump has unleashed all manner of personal and political attacks. I mean, he's unleashing everything that he has in his arsenal on Ron DeSantis, talking about the different statistics that he can use to show that Florida isn't quite as great as you think, right? The problem is, by pointing to certain education statistics, crime statistics, et cetera, that's all overridden by the fact that Ron DeSantis won a landslide victory. In other words, the people of Florida have delivered their verdict on Ron DeSantis, and it has propelled him to a place where you refer to him as a dark horse, Mark, but I think in the minds of many people, including many conservatives who are looking for an alternative, a less combustible alternative than Donald Trump while supporting the same policies. Ron DeSantis is considered a favorite. In fact, he does just as well, if not slightly better than Trump against Biden. And then there's the matter of these polls. Okay, and I'm going to do a more thorough piece on this for LibertyNation.com, but, Trump is trying to promote all these polls showing that he is ahead of DeSantis in these national polls. And he is by anywhere from, I'm going to say 10 to 20 points. He has a decisive lead in most of these national polls. But that belies the fact that in state polls, state by state, in battleground states, DeSantis is leading. Now, that seems to be self-contradictory. How can that be? Well, early in the game like this, and it's still early for 2024, name recognition becomes critical. No one has better name recognition than Donald Trump. Ron DeSantis may be well known to those of us who are political junkies, but he's not terribly well known to the average American. So that whole thing is yet to play out. But I can tell you that the state polls in critical battleground states like Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania and Florida paint a very different picture of the race than the national polls do.
Do you think that's a lot of independents coming out? People who don't like let's call it the wokery of the left, or the bombasticness perhaps of the Donald Trump presidency, but enjoyed the policies and the policies that took place during the presidency.
Yes, so indeed. And 40% of the country declares itself as being independent. So who has a greater appeal to independence, Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis? Well, in 2020, Donald Trump essentially lost the election because of independents who just had enough of his approach, shall we say, and his attitude and that kind of thing. So, I think that if Donald Trump didn't feel threatened by DeSantis, he wouldn't go through the tirades that he's been, including personal attacks. So I think Trump is really the one on the defensive. And it's more a matter of how DeSantis handles his newfound, I'm going to call it semi-front-runner status in the Republican Party.
Scott, you've been keeping up to date on this. And in a recent Truth Social post, Trump, he came out swinging with a bunch of figures in an attempt to almost eviscerate Ron DeSantis' Florida record. So first, I guess, how accurate do you think those claims are? And second, I'm wondering, what's the political downside for lambasting the most popular Republican governor in America?
Well, I haven't fact-checked the data on Florida's education statistics and whatever else Trump went on about, but it was basically all these things are bad about Florida under DeSantis. And, I think Tim responded at the start of his response where he talked about how the people of New York feel a certain way. And it's sort of how the people of the place feel about the place tells you what their leaders are. So the people of Florida, by their vote, have said, we're happy about the job this guy's doing. Yeah. And so that tells us all, I think, all we need to know about, he's clearly not a perfect person in governance, Ron DeSantis, that is. But I think that a lot of governors around the state wish they could be in his position with respect to popularity among their own voters. And the second question you asked was, what does that mean for Donald Trump to denigrate DeSantis and in the minds of the primary voters? Well, I can tell you that it seems like it would diminish Trump among Republican primary voters who get fed a regular diet from their chosen news media sources of positive stories about Ron DeSantis, generally because DeSantis is a skilled political operator. He's doing all the right things in terms of attacking the woke where they live with the trans children pushing and all that kind of stuff. That's all seems to be playing very well to to Republican primary voters or likely Republican primary voters. So I can't imagine that that's going to accrue much to Trump's benefit with those folks.
It reminds me of was it Ronald Reagan's 11th commandment? Thou shalt not attack fellow Republicans.
Yes.
Don't speak ill of
Don't
fellow
speak ill of
Republicans.
another Republican, right? Well, that's not something that Donald Trump ever signed on to. He doesn't adhere to the Republican 11 commandments. And yeah, I think Scott's right. I don't see rank and file Republicans responding positively to Donald Trump going scorched earth on Ron DeSantis. I don't think that Trump has quite the standing to do it anymore. You can look at it this way, and Ron DeSantis pointed this out. The first comment that he really made directly about Trump, although it wasn't direct, but it was obvious, he said, essentially, I'm a winner and he's a loser. He's saying I won by 20 points in Florida, whereas Trump lost in 2018. So he's trying to sort of flip the narrative to say Trump is the loser, I'm the winner. And that is something that drives Trump insane because to him, his whole image is about winning. And I'll say this, if he doesn't win the presidency this time, he's not going to go down as a winner in political circles. He's going to go down as someone who somehow won an impossible victory once, but could not take that and harness it into continued political power.
Okay, and I guess we're going to wrap this up with a quick look at what the polls are saying. Now, as you pointed out earlier, Tim, the national polls, they give Trump a heady lead, 10 to 20 points, I think you mentioned, over DeSantis. How much do you think this will change once DeSantis officially declares?
Well, I think it's going to tighten up quite a bit because right now DeSantis is just a prospective candidate. And even though we all know he's going to run, and he basically told Piers Morgan in this interview where he went after Trump that he's going to be in, but he isn't in yet. So the average kind of voter is not in a position really to evaluate him. They also don't care particularly about what he did in Florida, except to the extent that he takes that same agenda and brings it national. But I think most of this depends on what I call the war on wokeness. And Ron DeSantis has declared himself general of the army in that war. And we'll see whether he can, overtake the 45th president of the United States in the hearts and minds of Republican voters who still, for the most part, think very fondly of Trump's record, if not his personality.
Gentlemen, thanks ever so much for joining me.
Always a pleasure.
And that's about all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio America Network. I'd like to thank our special guests, Tim Donner and Scott D. Cosenza, and of course, you, the listeners at home, for taking the time to tune in. I'll leave you with a final thought courtesy of G.K. Chesterton, who wrote, quote, "Fairy tales do not tell children the dragon exists. Fairy tales tell children the dragons can be killed," end quote. Now, he's talking about narratives. He's talking about the power inherent with some stories. And that's an important point to consider, for the facts may be the facts, but the way we hear and understand them may be something else entirely. Folks like Alvin Bragg may think they are the dragon slayer, but that's not necessarily how this looks to the outside world. He's in serious danger of being cast as the villain, and of course, showing those good knights how he can be vanquished. Just something to think about. Thanks for listening. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides. Entertaining, informative, and just plain fun. Watch Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5. Produced by conservatives for conservatives. C5's The Left Free Zone. Hosted by Liberty Nation's Lisa K. Donner. Joined by a raucous, irreverent panel of authors. Deconstructing leftist narratives. Debating the hot topics. And remembering to laugh. Join the official conservative safe space.
You only did that to piss Jeff off.
Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5.